Hello, good evening, and welcome back. So with all the talk about coronavirus and airlines going under and wanting bailouts because apparently they can't sort it out themselves, even though you would have thought that if it was in the airport's best interests, then they wouldn't be charging the airlines so much, understanding that they'd be going under. But instead of that, the airlines want bailouts from the government, like Virgin Atlantic wanting £7.5 billion to cover their losses instead of allowing a newcomer in a couple of months to try and take over the market. Instead, they want to maintain their monopoly, and their big companies that are well established, they want government intervention in order to stay afloat. So with the rest of us who are being told to stay home and therefore we can't make money like we used to be able to, we still have to pay for them who can't make money. So hey, who cares about the little guy? After all, they just care about the bigger companies. So instead of going down that route, I figured we'd tackle something a lot lighter. How to argue with a racist. 5 myths debunked. Thank you, BBC. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they might actually have some good points. They don't, and they contradict themselves, but nonetheless, let's go into it. So, myth number 1, the DNA of white and black people is completely different. So they say the primary pigment in human skin is melanin, is used to protect us from the sun. And that all humans share almost all the same DNA, a fact that portrays all of our recent origins from Africa. Depending whether or not you actually believe we're from Africa is a different story, given the great cataclysmic event 13,600 years ago, which isn't widely acknowledged but does actually have very good evidence to support the hypothesis. But for whatever reason, it just doesn't agree with the current academics who wish to place Egypt at about 6,000 years old, to coincide with the idea of the Bible origins as well. But even that is basically just histories of psychedelic origins, and just trying to hide their psychedelic rituals from the authorities. But nonetheless, so yes, the DNA, I think we share 99.5% of it with apes, and about 50% of it with a banana, 99% with a fruit fly. It's very similar. Because all living things, especially having the same origin, however many billions of years ago, of course there are still a great many similarities between us. Of course, I don't think that's really disputed by anybody, but it does contradict their final point of myth number 5, which we will get to in good time. But they say that there is more genetic diversity on the continent of Africa than in the rest of the world put together. Yes, where you've got the Ethiopians and the pygmies, you've got the tallest and the shortest, and also the fastest, and so on. Unless you include like T13 from Australia, from several thousand years ago, who is supposed to have run quite a lot quicker. It doesn't have a proper name, given that it's just some footprints that are spread out. And so they've estimated how quickly they can run, and they would be significantly faster than even Usain Bolt, given the size of the footprints, the spread of them, and how far away they are from each other. And that's in Australia. And they say that 2 people from different tribes in southern Africa will be more genetically different from each other than a Sri Lankan, a Maori, and a Russian. So, fair enough, fantastic. Yes, we are all humans. Wonderful, wonderful. So they say there is such a thing as racial purity. And they say that isn't the case, given that people have been moving around the world for thousands of years, of course, and we've been mixing, so you can create some sort of culture, and the cultural impact is something that they really miss out on here. So they say that people have moved around the world throughout history and had sex whenever and wherever they could. Obviously, the issue with that, which ties into the genetic differences, is that mixed race parents tend to have, or mixed race offspring, if you will, tend to have greater genetic problems, like respiratory illnesses, so it's breathing difficulties, or heart problems, any sort of ailments like that, not too dissimilar from cultures where they have greater proportion of cousin marriages and incest, essentially, where you also have children who suffer with genetic conditions that their parents being related just reinforces the negatives and doesn't allow for the evolution essentially to propagate and to combine the best of both. That you need it different, but not too different, and similar, but not too similar, essentially. Otherwise, you end up with genetic complications. So myth number 3, Germany for the Germans, Turkey for the Turks, and other variations. This is where they try to mention it down to genetics again, and race. That's their main idea, that we've all moved around a lot. And yes, of course we have, but we have still been able to establish a culture, a way of living. Britons are known to be far more polite, Germans are known to be more regimental, and Americans are known to be more freedom-loving. There are stereotypes that exist for different cultures for a good reason, because that is how they are portrayed when it comes to that size of the nation. And obviously the nations are greatly important, as shown by the wars over the years, over the decades, the centuries, which are done between nations. And of course they are done within nations as well, civil wars, even though there's nothing civil about them. But that, again, comes from the difference in culture in their communities when they are fighting it out. And it tends to be that the larger they get, or that the more the enemy has to be foreign, that the individual differences are overlooked, essentially. So eventually you get the conglomeration of a nation state to then take on another nation state. Not to say that it won't degrade, of course, where you could have the Norman invasion in 1066, but then you've still got the English Civil War, and even just the War of the Roses, York and Lancaster, even though Henry VII was Welsh, but that's by the by, that it's still within England, and they are the warring tribes, in order to then be the King of England, of course, and create that new lineage, which is why people say that our current House of Windsor is German, and that they changed their name in 1917, I believe it was, because by calling themselves Gotha Hamburg before that, while being bombed by Gotha German aircraft, it didn't sit too well with the British people, thinking that, why are we being bombed by planes with the same name as our royal family? This doesn't look too good. So they changed their name. Super simple. But nonetheless, just because they are from Germany and have German ancestry, it does not mean that they are the epitome of Germans. They are much more English and regal than they are German. So that's where they say Turkey for the Turks, Germany for the Germans, Italy for Italians. That the idea is a cultural shift. It's a idea shared among the community instead of being on racial grounds. And you have that, of course, with, I think the primary example would be Sikhs into the United Kingdom, that they do think of themselves much more as British than other people would. And they mention this quite well, and I think unwittingly, by saying that the British Isles, before the French took over in 1066, that part of the world had been invaded by Vikings, Angles, Saxons, Huns, and dozens of other smaller tribes and clans. So yes, so what we're talking about is that the British identity, being proud to be British and propagating what it means to have a Great Britain, and we don't want people who are coming in and attacking us and trying to change our culture and alter our way of life, as you are mentioning here by using the word invaded. That is the difference. If somebody wishes to join in and help out and be a part of this community in order to strengthen it and help each other out, then of course they will welcome. But if they're coming in to invade and force their way of life upon us, then we will push back, as we have done for thousands of years. And haven't been successfully invaded for 1,000 years now. So we are quite solitary compared to the rest of Europe, for example, who have been warring and invaded much more frequently than we have. That's why they mention 1066 so much, because that is the last time that Britain was successfully invaded. So myth 4, a genealogy test can prove someone is 100% white, which again just comes down to what does white mean. When they mention here that basically only white people can be racist because of their examples, which are not worth covering. But when it comes to being white, then where is the cutoff for being white? Are Italians white? You might say, well yeah, okay, what about Spaniards or Portuguese? Are they white? It's like, okay, yeah, sure. So far south of Spain you get Gibraltar, okay, so they're white, yes. What about Moroccans? Are they white? No. So that's the cusp then, the Strait of Gibraltar. Okay. So then what about moving east? So are Bulgarians white? So yeah. Turkish, are they white? So yeah. Georgians. So where does it suddenly become, you're not white? Because it does seem to be much more of a spectrum. So trying to understand if somebody is completely white doesn't really make sense. The same comes to racism. And when it comes to then xenophobia, it's just in-group preference, essentially, which everybody except for white left-wingers propagate. That is, we prefer people who are similar to ourselves and are more distrusting of people who are different from ourselves. And our communities, we feel more at one with people that are similar to ourselves, as I'm sure everybody really understands, and that's where it comes from. So trying to put race into this is very misleading. And so what they say here, that you can't find out if you're 100% white, you can just find out where your DNA comes from of sorts when you go back, so you can see where your family was. But as they say here, you are descended from multitudes from all around the world, from people you think you know and from more you know nothing about. You will have no meaningful genetic link to many of them. So you can pick out key points in history, like Genghis Khan, for example, that most of us are related to, not necessarily direct offspring, even though he was a right stud. What a player! Okay, most of them were rapes, maybe not. But nonetheless, many people will have direct lineage to him, but many others will be related to him nonetheless, because you don't have to go far back before you would have more relatives than there were entire people on the planet, in which case you've got to be related one way or another. And that's what they're talking about. So hey, not all these debunked myths are then debunked within themselves. But here we get to the great contradiction in terms, by saying black people are better at running than white people, which they say is a myth, but then say that yes, that's actually true, seeing as the last white man to compete in a 100-meter final at the Olympics was in 1980. So we could say black people are better at running, or we could say, it's clearly systemic racism not allowing the white man to compete, which would just be playing them their own game, but I don't think they'd appreciate that. Instead of that, the so-called racists apparently say that, black people, fast-twitch muscle fibers, which is ACTN3, essentially, that they have more of those fast-twitch muscle fibers, therefore they are better at the immediate energy required of things like ADP to ATP, adenosine diphosphate and adenosine triphosphate, which is what creatine monohydrate, the thing bodybuilders use. What that helps with, it's that black people are better at converting that in order to have greater initial energy and speed and strength and power. That's what they say. So it's a positive for black athletes, but apparently no, that's racist. So I guess then the Olympics are racist for not letting white people in? Who knew? So they say that on top of the relatively well understood phenomena, there's a psychological dimension of determination, concentration, or risk taking, for example. And if it was just down to that, then you would have thought that African countries would have done better economically speaking, but haven't. So that's clearly not correct. And I think it was Liberia that the academic agent, was it Lebanon? One of the two, did a video on Liberia, I believe it was, saying, well, yes, this is a country that hasn't been invaded or colonized in Africa, and you can see that they haven't done well at all. The real life Wakanda, that they've failed completely. So no, that it's just a myth of the noble savage, as they will. So studies have shown that elite athletes in power and strength sports are more likely to have copies of the R-type of ACTN3. The research indicates the gene occurs in a higher proportion of African Americans, 96%, compared to white Americans, 80%, which they say does give a slight population-wide advantage to African Americans to take place in explosive energy sports, so quick release, but doesn't come anywhere close to explaining the difference between the number of African American sprinters and white competitors, except it does. It really, really does. Because a small difference in the middle means a huge difference on the outliers, on the far ends of the spectrum, which is what's shown in IQ differences between men and women, that men have a wider bell curve than women, so you've got 9 out of 10 in the prison population of men, but also the majority of CEOs, 9 out of 10, are men as well, so men populate both ends of it. And you could say the same with disagreeableness, that even though it's just a 60-40 split, that women are more agreeable than men. That doesn't mean much in the middle, but if you were to say the most disagreeable person, that's going to be a man, you're almost guaranteed, and the most agreeable person, that's going to be a woman, you're almost guaranteed. It's one of those things. So the same goes here. When they say, well, they're really quite similar, it's like, yes, but then on the extremes, that's where you're going to find a huge difference, and where these small differences matter most, which you seem to be suggesting is genetic, in which case it counters your other points to say there isn't a genetic difference. And this is a positive thing. So, nonetheless, these are the five ways to talk to a racist. How to argue with a racist, 5 myths debunked of what they say. They propagate their own way as well to put down white people, but nonetheless, that's what people pay the BBC for, apparently. So there we are, something just to distract you from the terrible onslaught of the coronavirus, which will likely result in millions of UK citizens killed, but hopefully we can delay the spread over many months in order to allow hospital beds and ventilators to be freed up for people who are suffering more so. But hey, maybe it's just a way to cut out paying for the pension in this aging population. So with that in mind, stay happy, and until next time, have a good one.